I'm originally not from Detroit. I am from New York. I've been living in Detroit for the past year and a few months. In that year, I've been working with various different organizations to develop a curriculum for the youth, particularly with the General Baker Institute, in which we're focusing on developing curriculum and ways to engage younger folks to get them engaged on political and education and political and economic theory in particular. I'm also one of the coordinating committee members for the Michigan's Poor People's Campaign, which I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with that, but it's a campaign that started in North Carolina with Reverend Barber and Liz Steele Harris. It's basically a campaign that seeks to revive Dr. King's idea of a Poor People's Campaign that focuses mainly on working class issues. At this particular moment, we're focusing on the war economy, or focusing on systemic racism, systemic poverty, and environmental degradation, and tackling those things in many different ways. And the hope is to create a massive campaign in which we can engage in civil disobedience for 40 straight days in the coming year to change the narrative around a crazy president who's just tweeting every single second into a narrative in which focuses more on the real issues that are affecting poor people all around this country. I'm also an educator, not only of politics, but also of natural building. I do upcycling random stuff and restoring old houses, particularly my house at this particular moment. I'm the founder of the Minga Project, which is basically a project that we started here in Michigan to not only educate folks on natural building techniques and sustainability, but also help people remember old ways of living, which I grab onto ancestral knowledge and ancient wisdom from the Andes to relearn how to live in community, relearn how to teach each other, how to take care of each other, and potentially live in harmony and create a system that actually works for all of us.
Good evening. My name is Nate Walker, and I am a K-12 organizer and policy analyst for AFT Michigan. Prior to that, I was a teacher. I taught in the Detroit Public Schools for 5 years, and then in a charter school for 1 year. While I was at that charter school, I joined an organizing committee with some of my colleagues to try to form what would be the first charter school teachers union in Detroit. That was about 8 or 9 years ago. Since then, I have been working with the American Federation of Teachers and some of our locals throughout the state, I think, really on the front lines of defending some of the core principles around public education as a common good. A lot of that work has helped engage me in organizing with charter school teachers across the state in organizing unions in their workplace. I also have a 5-year-old daughter who goes to Detroit Public Schools and am very interested, invested in thinking about how we can rethink education, but also invest teachers and parents in being meaning makers in that process. And so I see forming unions as an essential part of that process moving forward. And I think if I were to describe what some of the work I do and that looks like from day to day, it's really having one-on-one conversations with people about why investing in something they care about can help change it. And I think that's just an essential part of teaching and an essential part of organizing.
Well, I teach in high school. I don't think I need a mic. Can you all hear me? Yes. So there we go. I teach at Cass Tech. I've been teaching at Cass Tech for 23 years. I started at CERTME, and we found out that we both did. We started at CERTME. I started probably a long time before you, though. And actually, the reason why I stopped working at CERTME was a union issue. This woman had the job that I should have had, which evidently I wasn't supposed to have. And then I started working at Lessinger Middle School, where I was for 5 years, and then I ended up at Cass Tech. because I've been with the union for so long, I've seen kind of everything. I saw the beginning of it when I started at Lessinger, my second place. I was pregnant with my son. So the next summer, we went on strike. And yeah, you're probably not old enough to know how long that strike was. That strike was more than a month, I believe. And he could walk a little bit, but he was on his little scooter walking that picket line with me in front of Cerveny Middle School, because I'm seeing the attack on the public education, and they've been trying to inch at it and inch at it and inch at it and inch at it so long, and now they've broken us apart so much that it's going to make me probably stop doing what I absolutely love to do. I've been teaching, again, for so long. My master's is in counseling. I've been offered all kinds of opportunities to go downtown, more money, you know, when you're in administration kind of thing, to go into counseling, you know, when you don't have direct contact with kids. And I said, as soon as I'm not in love with the classroom, I'll go do something else. I'm still in love. And this nitpicking and what's going on now with our district is making me rethink what I'm doing. And it's sad and disheartening. The bright part of that is, at this moment, as I look toward my future, that's not going to include DPS, I developed curriculum for Wolverine Pathways at U of M. And it's really interesting what you said, because the social justice, I just developed a curriculum for Wolverine Pathways that had that at its core. Teaching the young people to begin to see themselves in this larger space and kind of the institutionalized oppression that they need to be able to deal with and function. But first we have to teach them to see it. And so that's where I'm starting. She teaches little kids, she might ask.
You'd be surprised. I'll use it anyways. Hi, my name is Jacinda Venegas, and I am actually from New York. I also moved here with Carlos about a year and a half ago, or a little over a year. And I started teaching in Detroit last year on the east side at Brenda Scott Academy, and now I'm teaching at Mayberry Elementary. I do a couple of things besides being an educator in the public school system. I also am co-founder of the NIGA project, which Carlos told you a bit about. I also co-founded the Statistical Collective in New York City, which works in the intersection of gender and healing and social justice. And what else do I want to say? I'm really excited to be on the panel with a teacher who's been teaching for so long, because, you know, I talked to Craig, I'm like, I'm not from Detroit, like, how am I going to be in this panel since Detroit to speak? And he was like, well, you're brand new teaching, so the perspective may be interesting. So I'm really interested to hear more about the history from a personal perspective, and then, you know, exchange what I felt coming into teaching in general, which is hard, but then teaching in Detroit, which is another story. So I'm really, really excited to kind of share my perspectives and hear everybody else's on the panel too.
Sorry, there's only one mic. If you were here for the previous classes, you heard our mics and all the interference, so that's why we're using this one. We only have one. Well, thank you all. You got a sense of who our panelists are. We're going to have them speak a lot more. I'm going to take just a couple of minutes, however, and I want to frame some of the conversation tonight with a little bit of information about what's happened in DPS and what's happened in the educational landscape over the last 50 years. And I'm going to do it in about 5 minutes, okay? Maybe 6. And I'm going to miss a lot of stuff, and I'm not intending to capture everything, but I want to frame the conversation. I think it's important. And before I show you these slides that I put together, I want to put this statement out there. Raise your hand if you've heard this old labor slogan before: teacher working conditions are student learning conditions. Raise your hand high. I want to see how many people actually. So I'm going to say about 30% of the room, something like that, maybe 35. Teacher working conditions are students' learning conditions. That's something that we're going to try and unpack and understand more tonight. And we're going to get help with that, and there may be other things you all want to add as well. But that's sort of an overarching frame for understanding the linkages, the interconnections between how a student is learning, we're talking about Detroit tonight, and how the teachers are working, and how those conditions are intricately intertwined. They're not separate. We live in a world where we often hear about teachers being pitted against the community. The teachers are just thinking about themselves, right? You've heard that a lot. And so this phrase, this whole labor slogan, pushes back against that whole idea to begin with. Thinking about teachers' conditions is thinking about students' conditions. And so keep that in the back of your head as I just show you a couple slides. Did you know that in 1966, and these numbers aren't 100% accurate, but they're darn close, there were 300,000 students in Detroit public schools. It was like 299,000, I think. 300,000. 370 schools, and at that time, again, not perfect numbers, but roughly 1.65 million residents in the city of Detroit. Okay? So that was in 1966, 51 years ago. Jump ahead now, 2017. We have 44,000, give or take, maybe 46, maybe 42, somewhere in that neighborhood. 85% decrease. 85% decrease, right? In 51 years. 93 schools, we went from 370 to 93. So that's 1/4 of this actual school. The population, of course, is also decreased, which it does account for a good amount of those numbers going lower, because the population of the city itself is a lot smaller, right? 60% decrease, so it's more than half smaller, less than half the size of what it was population-wise in 66. So I don't know, some of those numbers may be new to you, maybe not. Yes, quick question.
Is the 93 schools in DPS or just in the city?
DPS schools. We're talking about, it's now called Detroit Public School Community District, which we'll come back to. And I only have 3.5 minutes left, so I'll go fast, okay? So most of this is important, because this is a great graphic. I'm going to share this with the Canvas site, and also if you signed in and your email list is on there, you'll get this slide so you can look at it yourself. I don't know if you can see it in the back, but it's really important to note that the enrollment declines in DPS are mostly in the last 25 years. I gave you a 51-year period. You're not going to be able to spend as much time looking at this chart as you'd like, but if you notice, since I can move over here a little bit, there's a diminishing, roughly equivalent with population and the school system, give or take, up until about 1990. Then it starts to accelerate, and you see a big acceleration between 2000 and 2010, right? Huge. I mean, you have the city only loses about 25% of its population. The actual school district loses more than half. And then you keep going, and so now you see in those last two figures there, in between 90 and 2015, that was 73% of the actual decrease is accounted for in the last 25 years. So something's happened in the last 25 years that has accelerated the decline of the numbers, right? And this, of course, it's more than one thing. And we're only going to cover a couple things here. But if you've studied public school financing in the state of Michigan, each state kind of has their own sort of formula, right? And in the early 90s, in 1993, Proposal A was passed. And I'm sure several people on the panel, Nate is, among other things, a policy analyst for the Michigan Federation of Teachers, so he could school me on this as well. But I think one of the most important things to understand is that the way they shifted funding for schools went from a primarily property tax-based funding for school districts to a per pupil foundation grant, essentially. So there's this chunk of money that is now affixed to individual students, and wherever those students move, the money follows them, right? And that was a huge shift in how the school systems themselves were funded. And when you add in the schools of choice, and some of you may be aware of that, but you now, after this law proposal A passed, you could send your student, your young person, your child, to a district that you didn't live in, right? It wasn't until this law passed that you could do that, and the money now follows you, right? This has huge consequences. Right, this is a couple years ago, but just to give you a sense of this, around $7,500 is the per pupil foundation allowance for the city of Detroit public school system a couple years ago. So let's just say $7,500. Let's keep going to pass my time. Charter school growth is clearly not the only, but one of the, if not the main, very close to it, I think it's probably the main culprit here, right? And you see that in this graph. And you see, and this isn't me demonizing charter schools, this is just me stating that as charter schools emerge and grow more, because I forgot to show you something that is very important. In 93 there, before Proposal A, charter school legislation passes, right? And so it creates and opens up a landscape for so-called competitive school systems, right? So charter schools emerge. This is a long conversation, but as charter schools start to grow after that bill passes, you can see in Detroit the number of public schools gradually going down until now we have a situation where, a couple of years ago, we now have more public school students in charter schools in the city of Detroit than we have in the actual public school system. That balance shifted 4 years ago. So the number's even different now, right? I had to double check these numbers because I was shocked. But just to give you a sense of, you take those, look at those numbers there. So you have 7190, that was I used an older number there. Here it was 7,500, but more or less, if you talk about 50,000 students times that amount of money, that's $360 million, right? So it gives you a sense of the scale of money that's shifting. Let's keep moving. Another complicating factor in all this, which we'll come to, is who runs all these charter schools, right? There isn't a single system. We now are in the city of Detroit, and we've been now in the city of Detroit for several decades now, where there are multiple school systems. And there's probably a different word to use than systems, because in some cases, if you look at this, it's too small. But if you look at this, and this data is old, you have some, universities or school districts can charter a school, right? So this is why you have Grand Valley State University with such a huge presence now in Detroit, because they've chartered so many different schools. They're one of the biggest ones on this list with 25 charter schools. This data is a couple years old. These systems don't coordinate, they don't talk. There's no reason why they have to talk legally to each other. They're separate individual systems. Last piece, and then I'm going to stop.
In Grand Valley's with like the DeVosses. The DeVosses were in ALEC were like big ones who initiated the 1993 and 94 changes, and that's why Grand Rapids is.
Absolutely. No, DeVos is a whole nother thesis. But absolutely, we should bring DeVos into this, because what we're talking about here is happening nationally. It's been happening in other places, it's accelerating in other places. Look at New Orleans, among other places. Let's talk a little bit about emergency management. What we also have to understand is during this period, not only did the state of Michigan pass, the legislator, pass these laws in the 90s, but it was in 1999 that we had the first essentially state oversight of the Detroit public schools. The state of Michigan took over control. How did they do it? It was different from the most recent period where there were emergency managers. What they did is actually the mayor at the time, Dennis Archer, appointed school board members that weren't elected. The governor also appointed a couple, I believe, one or two. In any case, for 6 years there, 1999, 2005, there was no local control of Detroit public schools. The state of Michigan, in different forms, had appointed who was to run the school board, okay? You then have a short period where there's local control again, and then we go back into the most recent period, which was a 7-year period, where we have 4 different emergency managers. 4 different emergency managers, ending only a little over a year ago, right, or a year and a half ago, I guess now, when the final, what was his name?
Rhodes.
Not Early, Rhodes, Stephen Rhodes, thank you. The final emergency manager of Detroit Public Schools, right? So what happened last year, and then I'm done. What happened last year is, what is this DPS-CD thing? Do you know what this is? This was born out of a so-called bailout, and this is a model that comes right out of the whole GM bankruptcy financial gimmick, essentially. If you remember when GM went into bankruptcy in 2009, they created an old GM and a new GM, a new co and an old co. The old company took all the debt. Don't ask me how this was done, but somebody gets paid a lot of money to figure this out. The new company had no debt, right? That was a part of the bankruptcy procedures for GM. It's not exactly the same, but very similar to that is what happened in 2016. And you have the old DPS still exists. Detroit Public Schools still exists. What is their primary function? To essentially pay off the legacy debt that had been accumulated over many, many, many years and accelerated under emergency management. So DPS-CD, at least in theory anyways, no longer has the debt that it had previously. That's what we're being told. So this is a really quick primer. I probably went a little bit older, so let me come back to the main frame here. And then I want to ask an opening question to the panel. I'm going to ask a couple questions, and then we'll maybe open it up a little bit with time. The first question I want to ask is, we titled this class tonight, Crisis and Context. And so the first big question I want to ask before we talk about this old labor slogan is, are we in a crisis? And how would you define that? How would you characterize that crisis? And what is, how do we understand this crisis? in the city of Detroit today while still being a part of building and trying to change these systems, right? Because crisis implies at some level a pretty tall order ahead of us, right? That things are really disarray. So are we in a crisis? And if so, how would you explain that to all of us? And whoever wants to go first can take a stab at that. And let's see where we go with that. Who feels like taking a stab at that one
We are
first?
absolutely,
Can you use this just because I want to get that on video?
if you don't mind. That's what we're
Yes.
I feel like we are absolutely in crisis. There's so much of what you just said that I want to speak to.
Go ahead, you absolutely can. So
I forgot. I should have written it down. I should have taken my notes. Let me see. Okay, so you talked about the emergency manager. Stephen Rhodes came in as if he was the great savior, and he came and he listened and he sat with us and talked particularly to the teachers at Cass Tech, because at the same time we had a bomb threat and they closed the schools in Bloomfield, but they didn't want to close Cass, and we had a bomb threat too. So he came and he spoke to us, and then we just found out he sold the street so that Little Caesars can have a street instead of us having a parking lot, and our kids, instead of having baseball, because the baseball team plays someplace else, and the track team runs up and down Grand River, and all the things that could have been on that great big lot. Well, now that's just where kids get to park, and they're not gonna have that either. So he came in and he talked about us, and he said he's for the teachers, and he's a really soft-spoken little bitty guy, and he came in like he really understood. He was on our side. You better take it, you better take it. And when we were in negotiations, and as you talked about DPS-CD, they community district, when we were in negotiations before any papers were signed, I'm in it. I'm an English teacher. I'm an English teacher, so I'm reading everything that they were going to say. And community district, in a little bit, just a little bit, is going to mean that we won't have the right to have the union. That's what the community, that's why it was important for them to say community. That word community means that we're not going to be able to have our union. Because I'm like, why do you need to, if this is going to be that, why do you need to change the name of it? Because there's another, and it's called community schools. And it's just one school, or community high or something like that. Why was it important for them to have community in our name? It was important because it does something to dismantle the union. Back to 93, which I'm telling you, my baby was a baby, and we were going up and down. It's interesting when you were saying that. We were going up and down that picket line, and it was really long. That was McGriff, whatever her name was, Deborah McGriff. Deborah McGriff came in, and she got a signing bonus to come in. And she got a signing bonus to come in, and her job was to break up the union. That's what her extra bonus was going to be, if she were able to break up the union. So what they did at that point was they tried to have the specialized school. Okay, that's not a bad idea. You know, people want certain services for their kids. You want to, well, my baby is artsy, so I want to be able to go to the art school. And my baby likes this, and we're going to focus on science and math, and my baby wants that. All of that sounds really good, right? And that was the beginning of Paul Robeson and Malcolm X and all those kinds of academies that were all within DPS, but we were all under the same umbrella. Well, the thing that made us strike for so long was because in the verbiage for accepting that, and they weren't called schools of choice, they were called something else.
magnet schools.
Huh?
Magnet schools?
No, not Magnet. Cass is a magnet. That's just where everybody comes. But it's much like a school of choice. Probably when we leave out of here, I'll remember the name. But they were called something else. But it's like a school of choice. And what happened, they said that the people who taught in these schools of choice would sign their rights away to the union. And that's why, because at that point, if they signed their rights away to the union, our numbers decrease. Our strength decreases. Their power within their schools decreases. And they wouldn't have to, where our workload is regulated and our work hours are regulated and all of that kind of stuff and mandated by all the verbiage in our contract. Well, her job was to come in and make that happen, and she got a super big signing bonus if she was able to make it happen, and she didn't, because we wouldn't stop. We wouldn't stop walking up and down that street with the baby on a scooter. And then you talked about the emergency managers. So there used to be so many of us that we had our union meetings at Cobo Hall. And we had the union meetings at Cobo Hall. Jana Garrison was our union president. And when we went in, we were in the black, right before all this happened. We were in the black.
Explain what that means.
Oh, we weren't losing money, we had money. The DPS had money.
This is like before 99?
Yes.
Before the first, yeah.
Yes, we were in the black. So the contract was so beautiful. You know, you get 4% this year, a 4% raise. We had fantastic benefits at the time. And the next year we get 3% a year. It was, what, a 2 or 3 year contract. And it was great. It was set up for us to take it. And then she said, yeah, but, and there's this little part in there that says, you know, all of this occurs if by a certain time we have, or it doesn't occur if we have a $300 million in debt. But that's never happened before. Well, doggone it. And I told my friend on that floor, the next time we have to come up for negotiation, we're going to have a $300 million deficit. And didn't we have one? We had a $300 million deficit. Right, when it was time to come up for that very next thing.
Can we hear a little bit from
That's you.
Nate? I was going to ask you, Nate, and then you want to jump in, but you know, Nate, you've taught in the DPS, but you've also spent a lot of time in charter schools, right? Organizing, working with charter school teachers, etc. I mean, the same question. You know, how do you see this whole? Are we in a crisis, and how do you see that in the context of charter schools, perhaps, or do you want to answer that differently? That's just a question that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think to answer the question, are we in a crisis? I do think that the answer is yes. And I mean, I think like that I was starting to think about like a crisis of what? And I mean, I think I feel that one, I think there's an educational crisis, right? And the educational crisis is that since compulsory education in this country, since the foundation of it for the past 100 years, it's really just been about preparing people for work. And work is changing, and that's like viewing people as commodity and labor and material, and not as people. And so I think one crisis is that, like, as we're changing, you know, through globalization and capitalism, some of the changes that are happening to our economic structure, it's I think calling really important questions about why do we educate people. But I think part of the crisis is right now we're just left educating people to follow rules and to plug them within the class structure. And for some people that means being prepared to go to prison. For other people, for a small select group of people, that means being prepared to make decisions, right? And so I think there's a crisis of being able to try to deal with those types of questions in a way that helps us uphold, I guess, principles of what I believe to, or I think core principles that I believe to be important about public education, that is that it's a common good, it's accessible to everybody, and it's vital to sort of participate in the communities and the spaces that we occupy. And I think that as that starts to erode, I think you start to see some really scary things happening across our country, which are really starting to percolate now. So I think that how we're talking and preparing young people for the world is what part of the crisis is. Then I think that there's this other maybe crisis tied to some of the slides that Craig showed, and that is a crisis of how are we prepared as people who care about maybe some of those values and those principles about educating young people. How are we prepared as people to take on fights in defense of our principles and our values in our communities? And I think in Detroit, and beginning to put together a platform of, I think, education for our communities, we're not prepared for that fight. And I think part of that goes back to the slide that Craig showed about with the difference in DPS, I should say, the decline in Detroit public schools and the increase in charter schools. And I'm drawing your attention to that slide, not necessarily to make a commentary, like I could certainly make commentaries about the difference between the two and some of the policy problems. But what that slide also means is that more than half of the educators who work in public education in the city of Detroit work at charter schools. And that means that they're also not organized at the school level or in some of the traditional institutions that have helped plug people into taking on this fight. And I'm not saying that those there aren't problems with some of those traditional institutions. Those also need to be sort of changed through participation. But I think you could draw that, and could you put that slide up? Okay. You could draw that very same slide, and you could do that, and you could change the label of public schools and charter schools to schools with unions and schools with not unions, and that would give you a union density number. Right? And so basically that slide would show that less than half of the folks who work in education are involved in making decisions at the school level around their jobs and their workplaces. And so when that happens, that weakens the industry's ability to fight for some of the standards. Some of those are professional standards that we talked about, but some of those are the learning condition standards and the values of public education that I think Craig's question called. And so I think that that's where some of the work that I've been doing with organizing charter educators, I think, fits into this equation. It's how do you help the teachers who are working in schools represented by the blue line and the teachers who work in schools represented by the red line see that they actually have a community of interest in advocating for the education of young people in Detroit as workers and as people who care about kids. And so I think there's one other piece to that point that I was going to mention, and now I seem to have lost it, so I think I'll just pass the microphone.
So I would say that, yeah, we're definitely in a crisis, but to some extent I would also add that a crisis to some extent makes us think that this is by accident, that we're in a crisis and it was unforeseen. What I want to say is that we're in a crisis, but this is more of an assault and an attack on public education. And it's very interesting that you start in 1970, because in 1971, Lewis Powell, which he was a corporate lawyer and also represented 11 major corporations in the United States, writes a letter to then the director of the Chamber of Commerce. His name was Eugene Sidmore. And basically in this memo, he talks about how the core foundations of the United States are under attack. He's basically saying that we are moving towards a phase in which radical leftists, Marxists, and communists are attacking our fundamental values, which is free market. And basically, in this letter, he lays out a very strategic plan on what the United States and the Chamber of Commerce in particular needs to do in order to push against this attack or assault on public education and assault on the free market. I also want to take you back to Chile, because all of this starts actually in South America. And does anybody know what happened to President Allende, or does anybody know who President Allende is? Raise your hand. A couple of people. All right. So in September 11, there's a coup d'etat in Chile. It's a coup d'etat backed by the CIA, and it's a coup d'etat that to some extent is the mastermind of Milton Friedman. Does anybody know who Milton Friedman is? So Milton Friedman comes out of the University of Chicago, out of the School of School of Economics, and basically comes up with this idea of neoliberalism. In the 1960s, we see a crazy sort of shift in the political and social conditions of the United States with the civil rights movement, the anti-war efforts, and this sends us shockwaves through the United States. And to some extent, the masters of the world are taken aback. You know, when I say masters of the world, I mean the Koch brothers, the massive masters who run major corporations in the United States, and they see this as an assault on free market. And people start scrambling to try to figure out what is the best way for us to prevent these Marxists, these communists, these social justice warriors from attacking what we hold dear to in the United States, which is the free market. And basically, all these thinkers start coming together and they start coming up with this idea, which they come up with like the neoliberalism. And neoliberalism essentially is saying that like we must privatize public institutions, that includes education, healthcare. We must destroy the unions and those that are engaged in collective bargaining agreements and have strong power to prevent corporations from basically doing what they can do in the United States, right? So this is sort of like the historical context that we are jumping off in the 1970s, which later on other people like Betsy DeVos pick up in the in 1975, I believe, when she starts pushing for the voucher system in Michigan, and then later on in 2000, right? So when we talk about the education and our education system, it's an education system that's under assault. It's a well-calculated, well-thought-out plan that if you read, and I recommend you read this memo, it basically puts you in the present of what exactly is going on in the United States at this particular moment.
So when you said the word crisis, I kind of went back to my first day teaching last year, where I had a roster of 32 kindergartners, and I received 2 glue sticks, 1 large sheet of chart paper, like a booklet of big chart paper, 10 notebooks, 1 pair of scissors, and tape. And then I went to the classroom, and I was kind of like, what do they expect me to do with 2 glue sticks and 32 kindergartners? They're gonna eat it in like a minute. So that was like, that was a crisis mode. Or walking into meetings with teachers and trying to think about grades, but we have so much work and so many students that half the teachers say, you know what, I'm just gonna make up my grades. I'm just making up some of these grades because I just can't, like I have like 10 IEPs, I have this kid who's just jumping from table to table, the social workers are overworked, the psychologists are overworked, like everybody in the school, you can see when they came into the school, they didn't want to be there. And that's really sad because what kids need the most is for you to be like, I want to be here with you right now, like you matter to me. So when I was in that school, I was like, this is a crisis, it's clear, especially when you only have 2 glue sticks for 32 kindergartners. So for that first 4 or 5 months of teaching, I was in crisis, and Carlos can attest, I would come home crying sometimes from just stress and just being like, I can't do this, and just really just sheer like, you read things and I knew what I was going into, but once you're in the classroom and seeing all these policies and seeing all these guys talking about in person, that's a whole nother story. And so when I think of crisis, I think of all teachers who are kind of jaded, they're over it. They're not even trying, and it's not so much their own fault, it's just that we're put in situations where it's almost impossible to teach. And so, when I think about the slogan that, it's framing the conversation, I thought also like, it's not only the teachers work, what is it again? Teachers' working conditions are the students' learning conditions, but it's also the other way around. The students' learning conditions is also teachers' working conditions. Because when you're dealing with young kids who are, dealing with a whole other thing of issues at home, that's another level of work that we as teachers are supposed to deal with as well. So when I thought of crisis, I went immediately back to that first year and like the door closed and I have all these new kids and like few materials and I was like, oh my God, what am I gonna do for the rest of the year? So I did what every other teacher in the school did. I spent hundreds of dollars buying supplies and materials out of my own paycheck to get my class up and going. I think about all the budget cuts, I think about, all the school closures, and all I could say is, how is it that closing more schools is gonna help when the classrooms are already overcrowded? And you're gonna put all these kids who already are angry and upset that so much is changing and so little thought is given to them, and you're putting them all in one classroom, like, you're just, like, literally setting up a lot of students for failure, and teachers as well. So when I thought of crisis, I kind of went back to the classroom in my first year teaching. So yeah, that's all I wanted to share.
Can I ask you a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
So it's my understanding, why did you choose to go into teaching? And why did you choose, if you don't mind me asking, why did you choose to come to Detroit to go into teaching? I
So-
think, and I asked that for a couple of reasons, because I want to know, main
Yeah.
reason. But also because we know that there's massive teacher shortages, on the one hand, not just in Detroit, but this is a crisis across the country. That's my understanding, I think, anyways. How many people want to go into teaching? Raise your hand if you want to become a teacher someday in the future. There's only a couple, right? I don't know if I expected more or not, but it's becoming more and more rare to go into teaching. And is that right?
Yeah,
So
actually-
why did you choose?
Yeah. Well, before coming to Detroit, I had been doing after-school programming for about 3 years. I ran a school program as assistant director, and then I also did art programming in libraries through Project Art, which is a non-for-profit. And so when we decided to move from New York for various reasons, including like how expensive it was, I had to think about, okay, well, what am I going to do? And I had been not in the classroom traditionally, but teaching in other ways, and I really enjoyed it. So I was like, okay, let me do teaching. And so the other part that I wanted to talk about, and I'm glad you brought up, is that I had to decide between taking a traditional teaching route, which is going to get another bachelor's degree, then going to some preparation program and paying money and going into debt, or I could do a alternative teaching route. And I had read about both, and I had to decide, like, okay, what is going to be best for me? And I decided to do the alternative route. And I didn't do Teach for America, I did the New Teacher Project. They're both shit. Sorry, but it is true. And going into it, I kind of knew that, but to give you an idea, so first of all, out of the 60 people in my cohort, there's only 7 of us left teaching in Detroit. And it wasn't because they, got fired. They just couldn't handle it. They just quit. They were like, oh, this isn't for me. I don't want to do this. And then, so the way we got prepared was a 5-week intensive program that they only really taught like classroom management, and they taught like kind of lesson planning, but not really. And then you taught summer school, and then you applied for a school, and you could only apply to EAA schools. Right? And I know that across the U.S. and there is a
Explain
teacher
what EAA is.
of the Education Achievement Authority. It was even hard. At first I wasn't sure what it was when I first got here, but it's like a charter district, but also a public school. Because I was told it was a public school when I would talk to them, but then other people were like, oh, you're teaching at a charter school. So I was like, I both, doesn't exist anymore because they failed miserably. At their goal, which was to raise these low-performing schools.
Just a little side for that. So they said their goal was to raise the low-performing schools. The way they populated the EAA, the year before, and it's the first time it's ever happened, and the first and last time it's ever happened, teachers had to reapply, which I actually thought was a good deal. People had to reapply for their jobs. You couldn't just have a job because you've had it so long. You couldn't keep your job because you've had it so long. So people had to reapply for their jobs. And the people who didn't get chosen ended up in EAA. Yes, that's how you populate a school district that's gonna raise scores.
Can I just get a little bit
more about EAA.
Yeah, and let me, I think you got a really good perspective as to like
I did not say those things.
some of the problems of the EAA practice, but maybe a little bit of a sort of origin story in connection to what Carlos laid out about public education being under attack and some of these policies being architected by Milton Friedman. So in 2008-2009, the Obama administration set up a competitive grant application for states to apply for federal funding called Race to the Top. And so this is one of the first times in which federal funding was going to be given to schools in a way that wasn't tied to Title I dollars. So schools get federal funding right now in one basic way. It's Title I dollars that's connected to need for free or reduced lunch. And as a way of trying to push forth some neoliberal reform agendas across the country, the Obama administration said, we're going to create a grant application process and states are going to apply for X amount of money, but their applications will be judged as to whether or not they do a couple things. And so there was a rubric built out that the Race to the Top grant was scoring. Some of the things that gave you positive points on that rubric were whether or not you had friendly charter school legislation to grow charter schools, or whether or not you had collective bargaining in your state was on the rubric. So basically in 2009, mostly the Republican legislature in Michigan at that time, over the Christmas break, changed a bunch of the laws in the revised school code to make our state more attractive for the Race to the Top funding. And one of these laws, which is a pretty pervasive law right now, which is leading to a lot of the school closings, said that Michigan has to publish a list every year that ranks schools according to how they're doing on a standardized test from top to bottom. And the bottom 5% of those schools would appear on a list called the Persistently Lowest Achieving List. And by state law, if your school is in that bottom 5% of that list, you have to take on one of 4 reform strategies. One was called transformation, one was called turnaround. Turnaround meant that half of your teaching staff had to leave the school that was low performing. Option number 3 was to become a charter, and option number 4 was to become closed. And so in 2009, 2010, in the slides that Craig was showing, there was this period where Robert Bobb, who was the then financial manager, closed and chartered 48 schools in Detroit. The next emergency manager, Roy Roberts, was looking for reform models to do with the Detroit public schools that fit that criteria. And then, I don't want to go too much into the leads of the law, but like a lot of Michigan law, it was aimed at Detroit specifically. So it basically set up criteria, said that this happens only in Detroit. And so the solution to try to comply with that law, but also not have the Detroit public schools continue to run 15 schools at the time, was to create a intermediary district. So basically, it's not a charter, and it is technically a public school, but it was founded by an agreement between the Detroit Public Schools Emergency Financial Manager and Eastern Michigan University. The only other point that I'll make at this time around the EAA, because I think it's a pretty important one, is at that time when the EAA was formed, if you were a citizen or a resident of Detroit, there was no public institution that you could send your kids to that you had direct elected leadership overseeing. Right? So the Detroit Public Schools was run by an emergency financial manager. The EAA was run by a board that was appointed by Governor Snyder. And charter schools are authorized by public universities, community colleges, or school districts. Well, if DPS authorized a charter school at that time, it was authorized by the emergency manager. And the public universities that authorize schools are none of the public universities that have elected board of regents. They're all appointed by the governor. So one thing you could do is at this period of time, you could kind of draw a little power map of who's actually making decisions around schooling in Detroit, and all arrows led directly to the governor's office. So just like, I think that's a way of just sort of conceptualizing where the EAA came from and who was making decisions about schooling at that time. Yeah, sorry about that.
So in that line with EAA and the New Teacher Project, they had a contract with the EAA. So we couldn't apply to any other school outside of the EAA schools because they had, they didn't have enough teachers and they had very low teacher retention. So I thought that was a very important fact because, you're sending ill-prepared teachers into an environment that requires extremely well-prepared teachers who are ready to handle the workload and who are ready to handle, teaching to students in a particular way. So I thought, looking back, if they really wanted to help what they so-called, they were thinking they're helping the city. If you want to help the city, you should really, hire people from the city. I know I'm not from there, but hire people from the city and then pay for them to go to school or find a way to do something in between. But the reason I got into teaching is because I am also part of, I've been doing social justice work for some time now, and I've been developing a curriculum for the Popular Education Project in conjunction with the GBI, like Carl's talking about, and the Poor People's Campaign. So I was hoping that in entering education, I could begin to show young people, because I work in lower elementary, so that's like kindergarten, first grade, second grade, I could begin to pull out, those critical thinking elements. And I noticed really quickly that it's really, really hard to do that, because you have to jump through so many loops and do all these curriculums, which during the AA, that's another thing, the curriculum companies that are running the schools, I would have curriculum corporate people come in to see how I was teaching their curriculum. It wasn't even my school leaders. It wasn't anybody from, Detroit Public Schools. It was somebody from their corporate headquarters that was like coming in to see how I was teaching their curriculum, which I was just like really taken aback with, because it made me feel really uncomfortable. I'm like, because there's nothing that they could gain from, there's nothing for me to gain from that. If you're gonna come observe me, I expect you to tell me how I can grow. And that's not kind of what, I don't think that's what they were looking for, even though they did tell me what I had to do. And I couldn't stray away from how they wanted me to teach their curriculum. Because if I strayed away from it, then all of a sudden I wasn't doing it right. Which I also thought was like, that's just not fair, because, And the last thing I will say is that in the kindergarten curriculum for social studies, I was looking through, their big storybooks that they give us for the young kids. And in the colony section, it said, that people in the colonies pick their kind. And when I read that sentence, I closed the book and I was like, nope, this is not gonna go in the minds of any of these students right here, because that's just not true. There's clear names for everything and what happened. So after that experience, I was like, wow, it's just ridiculous. And I'm still teaching because I have some kind of hope, but I really just hope that, I can get out of the public school system at this moment, because I'm really frustrated at the moment with seeing any kind of change when, there is not enough room in my head to think of doing work other than teaching, because I'm already overloaded. Does that make sense? So every day, even though I want to come home and read, I want to come home and do all these things, my head is always thinking like, okay, I have to do, lesson planning for the next day. I have to make sure I have all the markers out here. I have to make sure I have prepped my materials for this. I have to think about, I have to give administration my attendance sheet every day, sign this, sign that. So my mind doesn't have any time to be anything but a teacher, even though I'm so many other things. And that's something that I think I'm struggling with, and I think other teachers are struggling with. Yeah.
So, thank you. While we give our speakers some water, I'm gonna propose that we mix this up a little bit, and I do want to break into some small groups. These have been really powerful to do, but we still have a little bit of time, and so I'm sure there are questions out there. I'm sure there are comments out there. Why don't we take a few from the floor? You can come up and use the mic if you'd like, or you can stand. But I'd love to hear what you all are thinking, and maybe we'll take a few and then get a little response here. So please, and maybe tell us your name, remind us of who you are.
I'm a member of the community. My name's Andy Pappas. I think one of the things we have to remember, the guy's name hasn't been mentioned tonight, but John Engler was carrying water for DeVos, Alec, all this, and this is when the assault on teachers became, I think, more concentrated, starting in I think he started in 1991, right after that, the charter school law and all that, but I just think that during that time, he also managed to change the narrative and make teachers look bad. And the charter schools came in, and that's also caused the problems with the teachers' pension fund, healthcare, all that stuff, because, well, I mean, I didn't even realize that there was 51,000 students in charter schools, and when you look at almost $370 million that's going to charter schools, and I mean, it's been a deliberate effort to undermine the public school system.
Thank you. You can ask a question too.
Hi, I'm Julia. I'm a youth organizer in Detroit. So I work with kids on campaigns in their schools. And I guess my question is just, I'm really interested in the ways that young people and adults are pitted against each other in schools. And the way that the educational structure like puts so much pressure on teachers that it trickles down to students, and then there's like this war almost in the classroom, it feels like. And so I'm just wondering from y'all's perspective, what can we do to mitigate that? Like, what are best practices that you see for sort of building unity and solidarity between young people and the very unique, specific oppressions they're facing in schools, and their teachers, and the very specific, unique oppressions they're facing?
One more comment or question, then we're going to come back up here and let the group field it. I mean, that was a huge one, so we can just go to that. But let's go to Michael first.
I guess I'm having trouble understanding why in 1999 DPS was performing so well, had such a surplus financially, and then was just somehow the situation was fixed. People were convinced to take that money away. I guess my question is how did that happen?
He just said it. He just said it. England. And it.
Here, sorry, never mind.
It was orchestrated. We were making money, and then we had Engler came in. Engler, I believe, Engler was part of the McGruff-Griff thing and paying her, and let's change what it is, because the, to join we used to be mandated that you join, you get hired, you sign in, then you have to pay the union dues. Well, now it's, if you want to, you pay the union. They needed to bust the union so that they would bust the power. That was the beginning of it. That was the beginning of busting the union when Engler came in. Actually, come on, really pretty lady was our governor.
Randall.
Yeah. She's actually the one who brought Bob in. Sadly, I'd like to think she didn't know what kind of damage that was going to do or how that was going to turn on us.
That's important.
But that was the beginning of the end. And again, it was orchestrated. When she got a bonus for making some of the schools split off and then sign away your right to the union, you know that there's attack on a union. I don't know, because EAA has been, many, but not all, and I don't know why not all. Many of the EAA, the defunct EAA schools have been absorbed back into DPS, CD. They say community district, I say can't do it. They've been absorbed back, so I don't know if that number is right, but those are the people who just went to jail. The people you just saw on the news, those are EAA people. And it looked like they were making more money because they made $80,000 or so a year, but they had to pay the health care, they had to work longer hours, and they had to work all into the summer, and all those kind of things where they didn't have any voice in any of that. But it looked good.
What about to Julia's question? Let's tackle that one, Nate or Carlos, or do you want to maybe this notion of students being pitted against teachers, adults against children, how this manifests itself in schools today, not just in Detroit, of course, but certainly we're talking about Detroit.
Well, that's a big question, and I don't think we can answer that at this particular moment. But I would say one thing though. My suggestion for teachers would be don't shy away from the real issues. A lot of these kids that are going into these classrooms are coming from very disadvantaged backgrounds, and don't be afraid to talk about those things. To some extent, I feel like kids will find some sort of connection in that, because to some extent, sometimes the teacher and student dynamics, there's a cultural difference, or there just simply is a power dynamics at play at that particular moment. So don't shy away from like speaking about real issues, talking about like systemic racism and systemic poverty, bringing like the curriculum home and helping the children understand that like, hey, this is what's happening. Another thing that I would suggest is like being there. This is gonna take time. We're dealing with a teacher turnover rate on a national level, which is insane to think about. Most of these teachers only stay on the job maybe 1 or 2 years, and then they leave. And the children understand that. They know that most of these teachers aren't as committed as they would want them to be. You know, so they see a teacher, they come in for the first year, they're like, okay, well, you're gonna be here for 1 year, and then next year I'm gonna get a new teacher, right? There is no incentive in me to like invest in building a relationship with that teacher. So it takes time. I think also would be, I would also say that like from the teacher's perspective, we need to start seeing students as bearers of knowledge. They are not empty vessels that come into these classrooms to just like be filled with an education. They come with stories, they come with a very clear understanding of the world, and it should be a dialogue. It shouldn't just be input of information into these kids' brains, right? I would say about stress too, like some of these kids are dealing with some high stress levels that I think in my generation and previous generations we didn't see, right? We're forcing these kids to become more accustomed to like taking tests, and every 6 months they're taking a test to like to some extent every 3 months, every season. They're taking all these tests to like sort of put them on a national bracket on where they stand. This adds unnecessary stress to these students to the point that like we're reaching like high levels of suicide rates in young adults and teenagers, which we haven't seen in ever, right? So like addressing that issue as well. Yeah, I would say that.
Just a little aside with that, they're not testing necessarily the kid. They're not testing the kids, they're testing the teachers. Because it's tied to your evaluation if your kids don't do this, or your evaluation if they do that or the other. And so that speaks to her question again, because you want the kids to do well, and then if they don't, then it's not my fault that such and such don't come to school. So then they do kind of get mad at the kids, and I haven't even thought about it like that, because that's my job is attached to that, so they do, and that comes from all that time testing, and it is pitting them against them. Not for me, but for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I work with the babies, so it's hard for me to like think of it as pitted against each other, but they do use those test scores to evaluate teachers. So it's not just the kids they're evaluating. They also use the test scores to evaluate whether that school should stay open or closed, or use one of those 4, solutions. Talking about systemic racism with the 6-year-old is really difficult because the language and the understanding isn't quite there yet. So it's kind of, I'm still trying to I found a book, it's called When You Have a Bully for President. It's a really good job of explaining some really big topics in a very easy way for the young ones. But,
When you have a bully for president?
yeah, When You Have a Bully for President, and it's in English and Spanish in the same book. But before I can read the book to them, I have to cover some things for them to understand about the books. And I have to cover that, that means like teaching them real social studies and not like the, glazed over, parts of a plant. We live in a family, which is important in a community, but there's more to it than that's just social studies. Because I do think that young kids, like 6-7-year-olds, can understand big topics. We just gotta develop the curriculum to reach them there.
we have one question over here.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you, and then I want to move into, I want to give you time in these small groups, okay? I know there's much that hasn't been said, but why don't we take this question over here last before we do that?
I was just wondering if you all could talk about the school to prison pipeline and like how the policing of kids within like the classroom and just like in the school is like, you know, that also is framing like their school experience and how they're able to even get an education.
I just want to speak on that real quick because that's how I felt at my last school. I think part of it was that it was a big school, so the hallways are really echoey, and also the teachers are all really stressed, and there's so many students, and they're all just trying to get everything organized. But it get back in line, turn around, like, you know, just very jarring. And I'm talking about like kindergarten to like 8th graders, you know, being talked to like that, you know, getting ganked, you know. And I don't want to say that it's right that teachers treat kids like that, but I also want to put in the context of what we're putting teachers into without any support. So that is clearly not the way that you want to treat a child, especially because it sounds like you are in a prison, like you're treating these kids like they're prisoners. You know, stay in your seat, don't move, you know, they're 6. I don't know how to tell you, but they're 5 and 6. They're not going to stay in their seat. You know, they're not going to stay in line. They're not going to, you know, they're not going to walk straight ahead. They're going to like skip and jump and twirl in the line. And it's annoying, but that's just how they are. You know, they're 5. I'm going to tell you. But I also understand that you have, you know, a bunch of 5-year-olds here and a bunch of teenagers here. And if you let them intermingle, they start bullying. So, you know, it's very clear to me. On top of that, this testing is all on computers. And a lot of the learning going on in the classrooms, it's on computers. So I have a list of programs that I have to use with my students that makes them sit down and just be in front of a computer and learn through there. So you're already training them to just kind of sit still and be in one confined space for a long period of time, like every single day. So I think that also adds to it.
So I think back to when I worked at Cerveny, which was between 2002 and 2006 or 7, and you know, and maybe this gets at, we'll try to get at the questions. I think the whole environment was dehumanizing, right? Like, and so I felt like my role was, you know, I had internalized, especially in my first year or two, that being a successful teacher meant controlling the classroom, right? And so, like, if that's a premise in which we're training teachers to add value to their work as to whether or not they can get kids to listen to them, that's reinforcing the model. And therefore, then students, I think, took on, they internalized that they were just to be herded or to follow directions. And I think, I remember thinking back a couple times when I was entering school, I don't know if any of you are familiar with like the Stanford Prison Study, but essentially that's, I did a lot of thinking about that as an 8th grade teacher, and like, was I taking on the role of prison guard in this prison environment? And so I think, so that was sort of a personal experience, right? I feel like I probably contributed to that pipeline by like taking this role on that was destined for me when I signed up for the job, and like unpacking that is hard on a daily basis. And I think getting at it gets at some of the things that Carlos suggested. From a like maybe larger like policy perspective on the school to prison pipeline, I would just say, you know, you've probably heard sort of like, I think it's almost been called, it's a policy anecdote at this time, right? Like they use 3rd and 4th grade reading test scores to predict how many seats to build prisons. And I mean, I think it's anecdote, but if you think about some of the legislation that's been passed in Michigan in the past year about mandatory holding back based on 3rd grade reading tests, it's just it's reifying on, or doubling down on some of these high stakes decisions that begin to label and track kids in different ways. And so I don't have any like real great answers about how to like bridge the gap between teachers and students organizing on common issues. I'm really interested to hear about some of the campaigns you all are working out and seeing if can maybe be ways in which we compare some of those campaigns up with teachers who are committed to doing that work. But I guess I think that's where it will start to begun to be unpacked, right? Is that we name the problem, come together around a solution, and fight like hell for it.
Real quick, quick.
Just
and then
real
we'll
quick.
respond.
About that. So like that's something like really personal to me. I went to high school in New York City, and in any given day, there was more NYPD officers in my lunchroom than there were like staff hired by the high school. A lot of people have argued that there is no longer a pipeline to prison. The prisons are already in school. And we see this a lot because some of the charter schools that are being run are run by prisons or corporations who also run prisons, or they run or they are similar to prisons. In the sense that there are some schools, I think in Utah, where now they have like solitary confinement rooms in the classroom when kids are acting out, and they actually put children in that. We're talking about like children that are 8, 9, or 10 years old who are acting up and are being put into this room for about an hour or 2 hours by themselves, right? So like, it's insane what's happening in these schools because at a very young age, these children are being taught that they are criminals before they are humans, right? At least that is how I felt when I was growing up. And it's a sad story. Like you mentioned about the economy and how things are changing. Like the economy is changing so fast that in my mind, people are looking at school children and already know that there's not going to be enough jobs for those children when they get out of school. But they're still members of society, and they must produce to some extent, right? So what do? We either criminalize them, send them to jail, or find something else for them to do. Only 20% of the school children that will be graduating will find a job in the next 4 or 5 years. And this is not to like scare you, but this is like the reality of what's going on a national level. And it's alarming to hear these things, but I'm hoping that this would ignite some sort of like a drive to like take action. We can't wait anymore. We can't sit idly. This is our time to take initiative, to start organizing. You know, the same way that these people are organizing against us, we must organize against them for our benefit.
I just wanted to say one quick thing to Julia's question. The one way that I've found to bridge that gap is like once a week, I just say, forget my lesson plans, and I just really try to build my relationship with my students. And I think that for me has been the best part of teaching and the hardest part of teaching. Because a lot of times we have so many minutes of this and that we have to complete that it leaves very little time for me to just say, like, hey, so how are you feeling today? How's your day going? Let's play this game. So that's the only way that I've been able to bridge that. And I literally have like a running list in my head of some kids, and I'm like, I haven't really connected with that kid. I haven't really connected with that kid. So I need to, next time I have that day, I'm gonna do that. That's all I wanted to say.
I'm gonna do something. I'm gonna take a risk here. Raise your hand if you want to stay in this large group and keep this conversation going like it's going right now. Okay, all right. So I just wanted to check. Obviously, we're not going to come to consensus. It looks like most people want to go into small groups, and I wasn't sure, so that's why I asked. We have 15 or 20 minutes in small groups, which is actually a lot of time. If, when I say go, don't go yet, but when I say go, you go quickly, okay? We are going to come back for the last 5 minutes. So if you want to hang out more with Shar, since she is our veteran teacher, she will not have to leave the couch. So you can bring your chair up to Shar. If you want to talk with Yesenia, then she's going to go on the back couch, and she'll be in this room, so there's still a couch for her, and you can hang out with Yesenia. If you want to go and talk more with Carlos, you're going to walk through here, but he's going to hang out over here for a minute first before he leaves, so you know where you're going. Carlos over here, and if you want to hang out with Nate, go over in that back corner, and then we're going to walk to a different room. And you're going to have an opportunity, we don't have a script here, so it's really an opportunity for you to talk more in a smaller setting. And we'll have a few helpers as well. I know we have Logan, I think, and Diana, and myself, and is Neela still in the house somewhere? Neela, there she is, thank you. Neela, can you help too? Thank you. Okay, so that means when I say go, don't go to the bathroom. Go to your small group. So up here is Shar. Okay, fine, go to the bathroom. You go there. Yesenia's back there. Hang out with Nate over there, and Carlos over here. Go. Wherever you want to go, you can go. Neela? 2 minutes to find your group. Top shop. Nate, just wait 1 second. Neil's gonna be with you. Where'd Neil go? Just 1 second. I'm over here. Neil, go over with Nate. All right, please go over with Nate. I'm gonna put down the mic in a second. Don't worry. You all ready? You're gonna go to the little kids room. Perfect. Now to get your little kids. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You know where you're going? Keep going to the
The stairs, they could be putting on the stairs, we have 2,500 kids, but they're supposed to be 2,000. They didn't even use commercial grade tiles within the first 2 years. The stairs were put on.
You can talk afterwards.
Just like to let you put your email on. You'll actually get, I think the driving force. And then you also get like a meeting of that.
And
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for joining us.
The hardest, I was organizing, as I graduated from the science and technology.
Yes.
Yeah. She's
I love learning sound. A lot of the music that was there actually was very beneficial. You know, like I would.
Yeah, you expect me, get over here, you know what I'm saying, it doesn't.
So they were really. My personality.
I'm not for the most part, black kids,
Very lucky.
you don't see it as it's kind of seems more aggressive, but my response is probably because that's what we hear at home.
Most teachers are, you know,
More aggressive at home.
and a lot of people are there. A lot more
Pain as some other kids. Now, we're talking little babies. I mean, really, I just don't see the need. I've never seen the need or anything like that. But
and I did
even
today.
teachers feel challenged in high school. Teachers feel challenged by children, and they feel the need to kind of one up them in effort to maintain that control. I think that the teachers don't know how to let the kids be kids. And
Oh, yeah, okay.
because they feel that they're
Yes. I mean,
by
and that's what I was like, I
entities.
can't
We are,
do that, but.
the district has a real pressure. Every single meeting, always, every other day. It's gonna be tied to the evaluation, it's gonna be tied to the evaluation, and every meeting is gonna be tied to the evaluation. Oh, I said that I'm trying to solve it for shares, but, and so the teachers do feel that there's a pressure, and they are often more disconnected to the kids because of that. They kind of feel like they're the reason for the problem.
When did I start doing that? And I had a lot of those moments from this guy.
And what I do find now, last year, this year,
So yes, in that sense, yes.
before, is that there is,
In that sense, it was.
with the parent, there's more of a going back and forth with the
In
kids.
my classroom, I
At a young age, I'm like, parent, why are you going back and forth with your kid like
but
that?
it was difficult.
You're the parent, you're the adult, and so I think that's
So we really loud, like some of these videos,
his
like
sort of
sensory
moving
stuff,
between the
had a lot of
schools,
trouble with
teachers
that,
saying,
so practicing on jumping.
this is what we're doing because parents are doing the same thing. And I
It
agree,
was
there's no
crazy
need to
for a
go.
minute, but after after a while, like,
But that's what I'm finding happen.
figure it out.
It's absolutely true that,
Is there enough time to attend to the needs of the children versus?
perhaps the lines of authority are blurred or something like that.
Sometimes, you know, the children.
And I value them, and I listen to them,
I felt about something.
and I hear what they have to say, but not about everything. That's for you and your mom, because your mom loves you and she has time for just you. I don't have time for just you
I mean,
because I have 38
at
kids.
first, like, I was like, a new teacher.
And that is the truth, and there has been a shift
like a Waldorf,
in-
like Montessori, and like, I just took this prep program, which was a piece of shit.
Children don't come to school
So
generally
I
as
noticed
mannerable.
real quick that
And-
it's already learned, and I made time.
With that level of respect for authority, not fear for authority, not the fear of it, but the respect for it, and they don't come in, and so you have to deal with those challenges. Teenage girls and those smart mouths, they just have to keep them going and keep them going.
Girl drama.
Oh,
I worked at a school in Wayne Westland School District doing dispute resolution for a couple
We're
of
not
years.
gonna do that, we're gonna have like an hour.
So I work as a mediator, of course, but this is kind of broad, it's public story.
We're gonna have like a 30-minute.
And I think that one thing that has made teachers' jobs worse, in my observation, I was working with 5th and 6th graders, is social media. How much does that affect?
oh, that is the worst thing.
Yeah.
Children bring social media into the classroom, and she's mad at her, and they are mad at them because of what they said on, well, it's not Facebook anymore, it's Snapchat.
Instagram.
It's Instagram, and things like that, and that kind of drama absolutely comes into the classroom.
I think it's made your jobs a lot worse.
Yes, yes, and
So before going
the
into
whole idea of the right to privacy, the framework for our the teachers, working conditions are the kids' learning
But I also
conditions.
like, cannot go into debt right now. Like, I'm about to buy a house, and I can't go into debt, so.
Our kids need to know that they are valuable,
I didn't.
and they don't often know
I
that.
had
Where
no idea what.
my classroom smells good, I bring in a little pluggy. And you can't sit on the desk, it comes with a lot of rules, you can't sit on the desk, you can't leave your stuff on the floor, or this, that, and the other, because you deserve to come into a clean, friendly, open, learning space. You also cannot do any unauthorized reporting, which is a big thing, because that violates some level of privacy. It violates privacy. You can't say shut up in my class. Why? You can ask people to stop talking, but you can't say shut up. And I always say that to my mom, they let me say shut up. And so to me, it feels like an assault.
People here.
Shut up. Some years ago, one of my former students came back and said, you let me know. I do a whole spiel about not saying shut up, you know, that you're going to respect each other to the point where you're not saying this, that, and the other. That's not saying shut up. And she came back and she said that I deserve for people not to discount. And she used the whole shut up thing as part of that. As part of her group. I need to make our kids know that they are in their environment for real. And they notice everything you do. They notice everything they walk into. They'll tell another kid to pick that up on the floor. Slide your chair up, this one's, you know, or something like that, because they know that they deserve that in this room. Then they'll go down the hall and throw crap on the floor and stick stuff up under the seat or something like that. So, if they don't feel valued, then they don't value themselves. And the not feeling value comes around there, because I don't feel valued from my district. They're attacking me, they don't want me to work. They're about to win. It's sad. I don't want them to work, but they're about to win.
So how do you make, you understand the
And she's like, they lost like 60% of their teachers.
So, you know, that's my next job, really. I want to teach teachers. I want to teach teachers, but the bad thing is,
and it's like, you want to be like, oh, y'all suck, but it's like, when you, if there's kids coming
I
to
feel
school,
bad
you
for
need
people who
someone
want to
in
be
the classroom
teachers right
to
now.
be there.
I want you to have that home. My oldest son is 27, and he helped his friend who was a young teacher at a different school. He would go in and he used to teach swim lessons, so they had a pool, and he would go in and he was phenomenal. Middle school kids, he was phenomenal with those kids, phenomenal. She commented on it, her principal commented on it. He felt like, I'm not his degree is physical therapy, his first. So, I think I want to go into teaching. He was thinking about for the masters, what you're going to do next. I said, no, you can't teach, you can't be a teacher. You can donate your time at some point and do some other stuff, but no, you can't do it. Teachers are under attack. Teachers are under attack right now. That is not a long-term goal right now, and I don't know how to reconcile that thought in my head and knowing that right now we're under attack. We know so much talent, and
Even for me,
you have to have a heart to be a teacher for real. You have to have a heart to be a teacher for real. Because you have to deal with little snotty Susan and snotty Susan's mom. And snotty Susan's mom now knows that she can get on here and directly get to whoever is at the top at the moment. And then that person then comes down to you and says, we're going to put this on your evaluation. And you don't get your job or something like that. There are so many things coming at you directly because we are front line. There's so many things coming at us directly, and I don't know how to reconcile that, but I want to teach teachers and see the goodness and feel the hope for those people who want to do it, and know that you're going to be amazing in that classroom, because that classroom is so important. Classrooms are so important. Yes.
So I guess like going off of the mutual respect between kids and teachers, I'm kind of thinking about like my experience as a student and that I haven't really had any discussion-based classes until college. And I think that's a really good way to show that the students you are cared about, and everybody has coming into the classroom and you're back to bring your thoughts. Do you think that could be something education that would help gain that like respect and desire to learn?
From Michigan State would come in
and give them their own agency if that happens. It happens in my class. You know what I'm saying? It happens in my class. We're Socratic a lot. This is oftentimes my class. Or we literally fishbowl, and then this, that is doing this, and we go out and find it and stuff like that. I think it should happen earlier, honestly, because people need to be listened to and know that what they're saying is valuable. But they have to be taught that because they're oftentimes not being taught that at home. They're not taught how to speak to one another. They're not taught how they They're not taught how to disagree and to understand that we're not all going to agree on this and still be okay about it. They're not taught that. And being in the classroom, your job is to teach them that. Your job is to teach them that that stuff is okay, but then when they leave your classroom after that 50 minutes, they still have to go back.
That's something I've often noticed at the school I was at, was I realized how many kids, now I was lucky, I got to work with kids on a one-to-one basis, with restorative practice, so one of the things is, I realized how many kids weren't getting listened to. And they would it really responded well because they were being listened to, but then they didn't bring that to that same environment. Teachers were actually the same way. Used to hear things like insubordination and things like this. And you were talking about people in the hallway and yelling at them, be quiet, be in a row, and it's like, this isn't the military. It was something I saw that I just didn't like.
The other thing I would say about teaching is, like, I'm not just a teacher. Like, that's what I mean first. I'm an artist and also organizer.
So my school cut like almost all of their like vocational electives. Central Michigan. And so I guess I'm wondering how much should we value those types of classes? Because I went to Germany where they have a whole track for education from 6 to 9. Just like the stark differences between the two. Is that even within the realm of possibility?
The vocational? Oh, yeah, pay for it. You see it on TV. And in DPS, we still have some schools that do that. As a matter of fact, I hear, I don't know what they say, but I hear that they are bringing them back into the fold. Because we used to have Randolph, Murray Wright, y'all probably don't know about Murray Wright. It is now Frederick Douglass, which is the alternative school for, you know, the really big. But, and Murray Wright used to give somebody, when you finish, you have a way to go earn a living. Now they're making that's post-high school. And everybody, you know, everybody shouldn't go to college. Everybody's not gonna go to college. Everybody doesn't need to go to college. And honestly, I think that they should provide some back into our schools where they can get a certificate or a degree. They used to come out with mechanics. Yeah, the mechanics, and they used to come out and do that.
They used to have MOTEC. When I went to school, I graduated in '74, not a lot older than most people here. So when I took auto shop when I was in, and they would aggressively go after you. MOTEC used to be something that Chrysler put out, and it was a very good mechanics school. But I don't think it's in existence anymore, but yeah, they had a lot of stuff like that.
Right, away from people that they had the heating and cooling, cosmetology, nursing. We had those things before something. Students there, and now we don't, under the guise that there's not enough money, but by the same token, they're paying companies to come in and consult. And so the choice to divert away from direct education just feels like it's
I just want to comment on that because, like, me and Lyndon met because we're both like creative writers and whatnot, and really just having a chance and whatnot. And so when you know what you want to do and you're oriented in that way, it's so going to be
because it works with works with students from 15 different schools in the Tri-County area.
They exchange, right?
Yeah,
so some of those kids are going to come to us, and our kids are going to. Matter of fact, it starts.
It just started our last program years last week.
Oh, did they do the? They didn't exchange yet, though.
The exchange will be in January. Yeah. So I and I'm participating in DPS schools right now. Our hashtag institution office. And it's really been interesting in a lot of ways. It's like I'm, trying to learn about the like classroom cultures and all the different schools that the students are coming from, because then we're kind of all like learning together once a month. But I wondered a little bit, just in terms of contextualizing at Casting a little bit, you mentioned that you referred to a magnet school.
Yes.
I wonder what you kind of meant by that.
It's the only true magnet.
Renaissance is too.
Yeah, Renaissance is a magnet school, but it's not really a magnet school. And what I mean by magnet school means that, you don't have to live in this neighborhood to go to this school. We are an examination school, so the kids have to take tests to get into the school. Or, because CAS is CAS, CAS has, they call them pathways, and you can audition musically, or you can audition, and act your way in, you can football your way in, you can play something your way. Yeah, there's some other avenues, but basically people test and come to the school. Magnet means that you can come from anywhere in the school, you don't have to be in the district. We are more magnet because we have just as many kids from the east side as we have from the west side, and because of the IB structure, which is a whole other thing. We're National Baccalaureate. New to us, but then we're getting people from other districts as well, so they're pulling in money. It pulls in kids from other districts as well. So Renaissance is a magnet school that people test in. They were actually structured after our science and arts pathway. But primarily, those kids are from the west side. They kind of live on
Yeah, like my mom was from the east side. My mom, in the 1950s, she graduated from Cast. She had to apply. It's almost like applying to college.
Say it again.
This was the last most.
It's the same thing. And the problem when they did that for people was, so a parent would put their kids in charter school.
Don't leave yet, don't leave yet.
The kids would not get the foundation. I used to work with kids who didn't get into CAS. You know, they have to do a whole thing. Right, and have recommendations, the whole thing. So, oftentimes, what would happen, the parents thought they were kids super disciplined, and then find out that the skills aren't there. By the time the kid comes back, their skills are so committed that when they go to take that test, they can't doing something else in their charter school. Because charter school, when they opened up all those charter schools, they weren't regulated. They didn't have to conform to all the check marks. They couldn't do all the things. They didn't even have to have certified teachers.
A round of applause for our excellent speakers tonight. The crisis of the commons and looking at educational crisis. Thank you so much for all of you. Next week, we're actually going to have a really dynamic panel. Sacramento Knox will be here from Anazokan, looking at decolonization and the Commons, and we'll also have Brett Fessel, who's with the Little Traverse Bay Band of Ottawa and Chippewa, up by Traverse City, talking about some of the dam removal projects and decolonizing water governance, and then Malika Keeney looking at decolonizing the food system. So we're talking about institution building and decolonizing the Commons and what that means from a cultural perspective. And it's Halloween, so please, we have some festivities going on.
We'll bring candy if you come.
Please dress up if you want to. If you need inspiration, think of maybe your favorite social justice. Come as you are, as always. And please make sure you sign in.
So we have their emails.
So we have your email. All right, thank you all so much. Go ahead.
There's a event tomorrow night called the State of Education that's being organized by a parent organization called 482 Forward, where DPS and the two largest charter authorizers are going to be having a discussion. If nothing else, it will be interesting to hear their perspectives on the next 5 to 10 years of Detroit's public education story. So I don't have the location because I forgot it. But,
Jesu Parish on the west side. Jesu Parish.
Jesu Parish on the west side.
Right across the street from U of D Mercy.
University District.
Yeah.
Great, and it starts at 6 o'clock, right?
I'm not sure of the time actually.
6 o'clock. All right, so hopefully folks will do that.
One last thing. Sorry, Ed will kill me if I don't ask you this. Please fold chairs and throw away any garbage so that Ed and myself and Diana and others can leave soon after you've left. And so please fold the chairs or maybe stack the green ones. Thank you again for coming. We'll see you next week.